Some men build walls, others dig trenches. Dalton Mercer built upward, 7 meters of timber and desperation separating him from the desert floor, where things that shouldn't hunt together moved in formation. The cabin swayed slightly in the afternoon heat as he gripped his rifle, watching the dust rise from below. 9 cougars circled the base of his stilts. 9. Mountain lions were solitary creatures, apex predators that avoided each other outside mating season. Yet there they were, moving with purpose that made his throat tight. The youngest prowled near the ladder he'd pulled up 3 hours ago. The largest, a male with a torn ear, sat perfectly still staring upward. Not at the cabin, at him. And somehow, Dalton knew they weren't leaving. The wood creaked beneath his boots as he moved to the rail. His hands were steady, but his mind kept pulling him backward to 6 months ago. To screams, to blood on different sand, to Iris shouting his name while he ran toward gunfire that turned out to be something else entirely. He shook his head hard, forcing himself back to the present. The desert stretched in every direction, endless and indifferent. No neighbors for 20 miles. No roads close enough to matter. Just him, the cabin he'd spent 4 months building, and the predators that had found him again. The sun hammered down without mercy. Inside the cabin, the temperature climbed past bearable, but going inside meant losing sight of them. That was worse. He'd learned that lesson the hard way when 2 had climbed halfway up the stilts last week before he'd noticed. He'd reinforced the supports after that, wrapping the lower sections in sheet metal he'd hauled from an abandoned prospector's camp. But metal only stopped claws. It didn't stop patience. One of the females moved toward the water trough he kept at ground level for the horse he no longer owned. She didn't drink, just knocked it over with her shoulder, watching the water disappear into the thirsty earth. The message was clear. They weren't here to hunt. They were here to wait. Dalton checked his rifle. 12 rounds loaded, maybe 30 more inside. Enough to drive them off. Probably. But he'd learned something about these particular animals that made him hesitate. They remembered. The big male with the torn ear, he'd taken a bullet to the shoulder 2 months back. Should have made him afraid. Should have taught him to avoid this place. Instead, he'd returned with others. The wind shifted, carrying their scent upward, musky and sharp. It also carried something else. A sound from inside the cabin, a soft thump, then dragging. Dalton's blood went cold. He'd locked everything, checked it twice, but the sound came again, deliberate and searching. One of the younger cougars raised its head, ears forward. It had heard it too. Whatever was inside the cabin, whatever had drawn these predators to circle his sanctuary in numbers that defied nature, whatever had made them patient enough to organize, it was moving. And for the first time since building his tower in the sky, Dalton Mercer wasn't sure if the greatest threat was below him or behind him. The sound came again, a scraping, like something being dragged across wood. Dalton kept his eyes on the cougars below while reaching behind him for the door handle. The big male's ears twitched. It was listening too. That bothered him more than anything else. Predators shouldn't care about noises inside a structure they couldn't reach, unless they knew what made those sounds. He pulled the door open with his boot, rifle still trained downward. The cabin's single room held everything he owned. A cot, a table made from planks, shelves with canned goods and ammunition, a trunk in the corner. The trunk. The sound was coming from the trunk. Dalton's jaw tightened. He knew what was in there. He'd put it there himself. It couldn't be moving on its own because things didn't do that. There had to be an explanation. He crossed the floor in 3 steps, keeping low. Through the window, he could still see the cougars. They hadn't moved. The trunk's lid was closed, latched shut like he'd left it. But the scraping continued from inside. Rhythmic, deliberate. He flipped the latch with his rifle barrel and kicked the lid open. A pack rat, just a pack rat, fat and panicked, tangled in the leather saddlebag he'd stored inside. The creature had chewed through the trunk's back corner, probably last night while he slept. It had been after the dried meat he kept wrapped in the bag. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by anger at himself for the fear. He grabbed the rat by its tail and carried it to the door. The cougars saw him immediately. Every head turned. 9 pairs of eyes locked on the struggling rodent in his hand. The big male rose to its feet. Dalton's throat went dry. They'd been waiting for this, for him to open the door, for a gap in his defenses. The pack rat squealed and bit his thumb. He barely felt it, because now he understood something that made his stomach drop. These animals weren't hunting him. They were hunting what he was protecting, what he'd been keeping in that trunk wrapped in the saddlebag. He threw the rat as far as he could. It sailed over the rail and hit the sand running. The younger cougars scattered after it, but the big male stayed. So did 3 others, the oldest females, the smart ones. They knew the difference between a rat and what they wanted. Dalton slammed the door and threw the bolt. His hand was bleeding where the rat had bitten through. He wrapped it with a strip of cloth and returned to the trunk. Inside the saddlebag, beneath the dried meat the rat had found, was a smaller leather pouch. He opened it carefully. The contents looked the same as they had yesterday, as they had for 6 months. Iris's wedding band, Nessa's small shoe, a lock of hair tied with string, and beneath those, wrapped in oiled cloth, the thing that had started everything. The thing he'd found clenched in Iris's hand after the attack. A cougar's claw, broken off at the root, still bloody, still sharp, proof of what had happened. Proof he'd spent 6 months tracking them. Proof that he'd found them. But also something else. Something he'd only recently discovered about mountain lion claws. They carried scent glands, territory markers. And this one, broken and preserved, still leaked chemical signals that would draw every predator in the territory, especially if they were from the same pride, especially if they remembered what had happened when one of their own lost that claw. Dalton closed the pouch. His mistake had been thinking he was hunting them. The truth was worse. They'd been hunting him all along. Dalton sat with his back against the wall, the leather pouch in his hands. 6 months ago, he'd thought keeping the claw was justice, evidence, proof that he'd found the animal responsible. He'd tracked them for weeks through canyon country, found their kills, found their den. The big male with the torn ear had been there. So had the others. A pride, an impossible thing that scientists said didn't exist. But Dalton had seen it with his own eyes. Mountain lions that hunted together, that protected territory together, that killed together. The attack had happened at dusk. He'd been checking fence lines 3 miles from the ranch house. Iris and Nessa were supposed to stay inside. They'd promised. But his daughter had wanted to show her mother a bird's nest she'd found near the wash. Just a short walk, just a few minutes. The cougars had been waiting in the rocks above the path. By the time he heard the screams and rode back, it was over. Iris had fought. The broken claw proved it. She'd managed to hurt one of them badly enough that it had fled, but there had been too many. And Nessa, small and terrified, had run in the wrong direction, into deeper rocks. He'd found her shoe 2 days later. Nothing else, just the shoe, and the knowledge that some things you don't recover from. The cabin shuddered. Dalton's head snapped up. The shudder came again, rhythmic and deliberate. They were testing the stilts. He moved to the window. The big male had braced himself against one of the support posts and was throwing his weight against it. 200 pounds of muscle and determination. The timber groaned but held. Metal sheets prevented climbing, but they didn't prevent force. A second cougar joined him, then a third, all hitting the same post in rhythm. The cabin tilted slightly to the left. Dalton grabbed his rifle and fired through the open window. The shot hit sand 2 feet from the big male. They scattered, but only for a moment. Then they regrouped, watching, learning. The sun was dropping toward the horizon. Another hour and it would be dark. He had lamp oil, but light would only help him see them. It wouldn't stop them from working on his supports all night. The cabin could withstand wind and weather, but it wasn't built to handle coordinated assault. He looked at the pouch again. The solution was simple. Throw it out. Let them take the claw. Watch them leave. The scent was what they wanted. Without it, he was nothing to them. Just another human in the desert. But throwing it out meant letting go of the only piece of Iris's last fight. The only proof that she hadn't died easily. That she'd hurt them back. It meant accepting that justice wasn't something he could hold in his hand. The big male returned to the post. This time, he didn't ram it. He started digging at its base. The desert floor was hard-packed but not impossible to excavate, and cougars were patient. They could dig for hours, days. Eventually, they'd expose enough of the post to compromise it. Eventually, the cabin would fall. Dalton checked his ammunition again. 33 rounds total. 9 cougars. The math wasn't good, even if he didn't miss. Even if they stayed in the open. Even if they didn't scatter and force him to hunt them in darkness. The digging continued. Steady. Methodical. And Dalton realized something that made his chest tight. They didn't need to bring the cabin down. They just needed to make him believe they could. They needed him desperate enough to come down on his own, or desperate enough to throw out what they wanted. Either way, they'd already won. The only question was which loss he'd choose. Darkness came fast in the desert. Dalton lit the lamp and set it away from the windows. The digging had stopped an hour ago, but he could hear them moving below, pacing, circling. The big male had excavated nearly 2 feet around the support post before Dalton fired another warning shot. That left him with 31 rounds. The cougar had retreated but hadn't fled. Now the silence was worse than the digging. He couldn't see what they were doing down there. He opened the leather pouch one more time. The claw gleamed in the lamplight, curved and wicked. Iris had torn this from a killer's paw with her bare hands while dying. That took strength he couldn't imagine, courage he'd never possess. Throwing it away felt like betraying her, like saying her fight didn't matter. But keeping it was turning him into something else, something that chose dead symbols over living breath. He wrapped the pouch tight and tied it to his belt. Not yet. He wasn't ready yet. The cabin tilted again, harder this time. Dalton grabbed the table to steady himself. They'd found a second post. He could hear them working at it now, not digging, but gnawing, chewing through the metal sheet's edges where it met wood. The sound set his teeth on edge. Slow, methodical. They had all night. He didn't. When the sun rose, he'd be exhausted from staying awake. They'd rotate shifts, rest, and return fresh. He'd seen wolves do it when hunting elk, wear down the prey through patience. Never let it sleep, never let it recover. Eventually it collapses. He needed a new strategy. Something they wouldn't expect. The ladder lay on the floor beside him. 12 feet of rough timber he'd pulled up when they first arrived. An idea formed. Dangerous and probably stupid. But sitting here waiting for the cabin to fall was stupider. He checked his rifle. Loaded. Ready. Then he grabbed the lamp and smashed it against the wall. Oil sprayed across the wooden boards. He struck a match and dropped it. The flames caught immediately, spreading fast across the interior wall. Black smoke poured toward the ceiling. Dalton grabbed the ladder, threw open the door, and tossed it toward the edge of the platform. It clattered against the railing but held. The cougars below scattered at the sudden light and smoke. Good. That gave him seconds. He swung his leg over the rail and grabbed the ladder. His boots found the rungs. Down. Fast. The heat at his back pushed him faster than smart. Halfway down, he heard the snarl. The big male had recovered from his surprise. It charged from the shadows. Dalton dropped the last 6 feet and rolled, coming up with the rifle leveled. The cougar skidded to a stop 5 yards away. They stared at each other. Firelight from above painted everything orange and dancing. The cabin groaned. Flames licked through the roof now, eating the dry timber. Dalton backed toward the open desert, rifle trained on the big male. 2 other cougars emerged from the darkness to flank him. He was exposed, outnumbered, exactly where they wanted him. But he'd counted on that, because the thing about trapping an animal is simple. Sometimes the animal has to leave the trap voluntarily. Sometimes you have to make staying more dangerous than running. The cabin's roof collapsed inward with a crash that sent sparks 50 feet into the sky. Every cougar turned toward the sound, and in that moment of distraction, Dalton ran. Not away from them. Toward the rocks where he'd cached his emergency supplies 2 months ago, where he'd hidden something they hadn't found yet, where the real fight would begin. The rocks rose 30 feet above the desert floor, jagged and sharp-edged. Dalton had climbed them 100 times in daylight. In darkness, with cougars behind him, every handhold felt like a guess. His boots scraped for purchase. His rifle banged against his back. Behind him, he heard them coming, fast. Their paws made almost no sound on sand, but he knew they were there. He could feel them the way prey always feels predators. He pulled himself over the top edge and rolled onto the flat stone. His cache was hidden in a crack 10 feet away. He crawled to it, yanked aside the rocks he'd piled for camouflage, and pulled out the items he'd stored. 2 more boxes of ammunition, a second rifle, a canteen, dried meat, and the important piece, the thing he'd traded his last horse to obtain. Dynamite, 4 sticks wrapped in waxed paper, fuses intact, left over from mining operations that had failed 20 years ago. Dangerous, unstable, perfect. A scraping sound made him flatten against the rock. The big male appeared over the edge, pulling itself up with muscles that shouldn't exist in a creature that size. It saw him immediately. Dalton raised his rifle. They stared at each other across 15 feet of stone. The cougar's torn ear twitched. Blood from the old wound Dalton had given it months ago had healed into a thick scar. This animal had survived worse than bullets. It had survived losing a claw to Iris. It had survived being hunted by an angry man with nothing left to lose. And now it was here to finish what it started. Dalton fired. The bullet struck stone inches from the cougar's head. The animal flinched, but didn't retreat. Instead, 2 more cougars appeared behind it. They'd coordinated the climb. They'd flanked him. Again. Dalton grabbed the dynamite, struck a match on the rock, and lit the first fuse. It sparked and hissed. The cougars froze. They'd never seen fire move like that. Never heard that sound. He stood and held the burning stick above his head. "You want this?" His voice cracked from disuse and smoke. "You want what I took from you?" He pulled the leather pouch from his belt with his free hand and held it up. The claw inside caught moonlight. The big male's eyes locked on it. Recognition. Understanding. Whatever intelligence moved behind those yellow eyes knew exactly what that was, knew what it meant. Dalton's hand shook. The fuse was burning down. Seconds left. "Then come take it." He threw the dynamite past them, toward the base of the rocks where the others waited below. The big male's head turned to track it. That was the mistake Dalton had been waiting for. He charged forward, rifle raised, and smashed the stock into the cougar's shoulder. The animal staggered sideways. The dynamite exploded with a crack that split the night. The concussion wave hit them all. Dalton's ears went silent except for a high ringing. The cougars scattered, some falling, some leaping blindly away from the blast. Rock fragments rained down. When the dust cleared, Dalton stood alone on the summit. Below he could see shapes moving, running, finally running, away from him, away from the rocks, away from the thing that had hurt them with thunder and fire. He counted them in the moonlight. 6, maybe 7, not all 9, but enough. Enough to break their courage. Enough to teach them that some prey fought back too hard to be worth killing. He sat down heavily, his back against stone still warm from the explosion. The leather pouch was still in his hand. He hadn't thrown it, hadn't let it go. Couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But at least now he'd bought himself time to decide. Dawn broke pale and cold over the desert. Dalton's ears still rang from the explosion. He dozed sitting upright against the rocks, rifle across his lap, jerking awake every few minutes when his head dropped forward. His body ached everywhere. The burned cabin sent up thin trails of smoke in the distance, a skeleton of timber and twisted metal. Everything he'd built, gone. He'd done that, chosen it, and now he sat on bare rock with nowhere left to retreat. Movement caught his eye. 200 yards out, near a cluster of desert sage, something tawny shifted, then another shape, and another. Dalton's stomach sank. They were still here. Not all of them, but enough. He counted 3. The big male with the torn ear stood in the center. The 2 females flanking him were the largest, the oldest, the smart ones who'd stayed back during the explosion, the ones who'd learned. They didn't approach, just watched, waiting for him to come down, waiting for exhaustion to do what claws couldn't. Dalton checked his supplies. 28 rounds left, 1 canteen, half full, dried meat for maybe 2 days, 3 sticks of dynamite. The sun was already heating the rocks. By midday, the stone would be hot enough to burn through his clothes. No shade, no shelter. He'd traded the trap of height for the trap of exposure. His hand went to the leather pouch at his belt. The claw inside seemed heavier than it should be. He'd kept it as proof, as justice, as something to hold on to when everything else was taken. But what was it really? A piece of keratin and dried blood. A territorial marker from an animal that was just following instinct. The cougars hadn't murdered Iris. They'd hunted. That's what they did. What they were built to do. The hatred he'd carried for 6 months felt suddenly hollow, misplaced. Iris had fought them because she had to. Because Nessa was running, and Mother's instinct overrode everything else. And now Dalton was here, holding on to rage like it could bring them back. The big male took 3 steps forward, then stopped. Testing. Dalton raised his rifle but didn't fire. The cougar took 3 more steps, closer. The pattern repeated. Each advance smaller than the last. They were gauging how much strength he had left, how much fight remained. Smart. Too smart. Animals shouldn't hunt like this, shouldn't coordinate, shouldn't persist beyond hunger or territory. But these did, because he'd made it personal. He'd tracked them, shot at them, kept the claw, made himself their enemy in a way that transcended food or fear. A memory surfaced. Nessa, 5 years old, crying because she'd stepped on a beetle. Iris had held her and said something Dalton hadn't understood at the time. Everything's just trying to live, baby. Even the things that scare us. He understood now. The Cougars weren't evil. They were desperate, driven by scent and instinct to reclaim what was taken, to restore balance to their broken pride. Just like he'd been driven. Both sides caught in a cycle of revenge that served nothing but pain. Dalton stood slowly. His legs protested. The big male's muscles tensed, ready to charge or flee. Dalton held up the leather pouch. The morning sun made it glow. He opened it carefully. The claw gleamed inside. 6 months of grief wrapped in leather. 6 months of pretending that keeping it meant something. He looked at the big male, at the scar where the claw had been, at the torn ear from his bullet, at the exhaustion in its posture that mirrored his own. 2 creatures that should have walked away months ago but couldn't. Not yet. Not until this ended. Dalton walked to the edge of the rocks. The drop was 20 feet to soft sand. Survivable. Behind him, the summit offered no more protection than pride. Below, 3 cougars that had chased him through 6 months of madness. He held the pouch over the edge. The big male's eyes tracked it, those yellow eyes that had haunted his sleep. That had taken everything from him. That now just looked tired. "This is what you want," Dalton said to the desert and the animals that couldn't understand words but might understand tone. "This is what all of it was for." His voice cracked. "She fought you, hurt you, and I kept the proof like it mattered." He squeezed the pouch. The claw's point pressed through the leather into his palm, like it could change anything. The big male took another step forward. Not aggressive, cautious. Dalton's finger found the trigger guard. 1 shot. That's all it would take. End the leader. The others would scatter. He'd win, survive, return to what passed for living. Except he knew what came after. Another month building another cabin. Another year watching for shadows. Another decade carrying hate that grew heavier with time. Iris wouldn't want that. She'd want him to let go. To walk away. To remember her alive instead of dying. He threw the pouch. It arced through the air, trailing leather strips and hit the sand 15 feet in front of the big male. The impact raised a small cloud of dust. The claw spilled out, gleaming in morning light. The cougar approached it slowly, sniffed, recognized. Its body language changed. The tension left its shoulders. The aggressive posture softened. It picked up the claw gently in its teeth, then did something that made Dalton's chest tighten. It turned and walked away. Just walked. No challenge, no final confrontation. Simply took what was his and left. The 2 females hesitated. Looked at Dalton, looked at their leader's retreating form, then followed. Within a minute, all 3 had disappeared into the sage and rock, leaving nothing but paw prints in sand. Dalton stood frozen, rifle still raised, watching the empty desert. It was over. 6 months of hunting and being hunted. 6 months of rage and grief compressed into obsession. Finished. Not with violence or victory, but with release. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. Always as triumph, never as this hollow, aching silence. He climbed down from the rocks carefully. His legs shook. When he reached the bottom, he knelt in the sand where the pouch had landed. A few drops of old blood remained, already being covered by wind-blown dust. By tomorrow, no one would know anything had been here. By next week, even the paw prints would be gone. The desert erased everything eventually. That was its nature. Patient, thorough, fair. Dalton stood and looked at his burned cabin, at the supplies scattered around the rocks, at the empty horizon where the cougars had vanished. He had ammunition, water, enough to reach the nearest settlement, 40 miles east. Start over somewhere without ghosts. Somewhere Nessa's laughter didn't echo off canyon walls. Somewhere Iris's face didn't appear in every sunset. It would be easier, cleaner. But walking away meant admitting they were really gone, that this chapter of his life had ended, that he was alone in more than just geography. The sun climbed higher. Heat began to shimmer off the rocks. Dalton shouldered his rifle and started walking. Not east toward settlement, not west toward nothing. South, toward the canyon country where he'd first tracked the pride, where he'd learned that some things couldn't be killed, only understood, where maybe, if he looked close enough, he'd find traces of who he used to be before rage consumed him, before loss defined him. 1 foot in front of the other. That's all he had left. That would have to be enough. 3 days walking brought Dalton to water. A thin stream cutting through Red Rock Canyon, barely enough to fill his canteen, but clear and cold. He knelt beside it and drank until his stomach hurt. Then he sat with his back against stone worn smooth by centuries of wind and watched the sky change colors as afternoon died. His supplies were gone. The dynamite, the extra rifle, everything left behind at the rocks. He carried only what he'd started with that morning. He'd seen 9 cougars circling his life, 1 rifle, 1 canteen, and significantly less weight in his chest. The canyon was quiet except for bird calls and the whisper of water over stone. No paw prints in the sand, no yellow eyes watching from ledges. The cougars had taken their claw and disappeared into whatever territory they claimed as home. The cycle had ended. Both sides had walked away. That was rare in nature. Rarer still for men. Most conflicts didn't resolve. They just exhausted themselves into stalemate. But sometimes, if you were lucky or desperate enough, you found the thing that let both sides stop fighting. The thing that said this far, no further enough. Dalton pulled Iris's wedding ring from his pocket. He'd kept it separate from the pouch. Personal. Just for him. The gold was thin, worn from years of wearing through work and weather. He remembered the day he'd placed it on her finger. Young and stupid and convinced they'd have forever. They'd gotten 15 years. Not forever. But maybe enough if he stopped counting what was stolen and started remembering what was given. 15 years of laughter, of arguments, of building something together in harsh country that broke most people. Of Nessa, 8 years of watching their daughter grow wild and bright like desert flowers after rain. Gone too soon, but real, undeniable, more than some people ever got. He slipped the ring back into his pocket, not throwing it away, not clutching it like a weapon, just keeping it close, a reminder of what mattered. What still mattered. Iris would have been furious at how he'd spent 6 months, burning himself hollow over revenge that served no one. Nessa would have been confused why her father chose hate over healing. They deserved better than the man he'd become on that elevated platform. They deserved to be remembered with love, not rage. The stream continued its patient work on stone, carving deeper by fractions too small to measure but relentless over time. That's what he needed to do. Keep moving. Keep working. Let time do its slow erosion on grief until it became something manageable, something that didn't define every breath. He wouldn't forget them. Couldn't if he tried, but he could stop letting their deaths be the only story he told himself. A settlement lay another 2 days east. He'd been avoiding it, avoiding people and questions, and the effort of explaining where he'd been, what he'd lost. But staying out here alone meant choosing the desert over living, and he'd learned something these past months. Survival wasn't the same as life. You could survive indefinitely with nothing but stubbornness and hate. But living required connection, required purpose beyond the next sunrise, required accepting that moving forward wasn't betrayal. Dalton stood and shouldered his rifle. The canyon stretched ahead, winding between walls of ancient stone. Somewhere beyond it, the settlement waited. People who'd known Iris, who'd watched Nessa grow, who'd ask questions he didn't want to answer, but also people who'd offer work. Community. A reason to build something again. Not a cabin on stilts, not a monument to loss, just a life. Simple, forward-facing, honest. He started walking. The stream followed beside him, steady and patient, teaching its lesson about persistence, about how even water, soft and yielding, could reshape the hardest stone if given enough time and refusal to stop moving. 1 foot in front of the other. That's all any of them could do. That would be enough. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where survival and courage are tested in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.